I apologize. I have a chest cold, and I'm armed and dangerous, but just to let you know, that's what's going on. Now, I do not work, we do not work, it's not just me, I'm part of a whole network of practicing formators, evangelizers who work primarily in the parochial world, primarily in parishes and dioceses. And that's because our primary focus originally was forming, our motto is we equip parishes to form lay apostles, but that inevitably draws you into working with parish leadership and then diocesan leadership and then clergy, etc. And so we're doing all of that at the moment. But this is what I wanted to share with you is what we're seeing on the ground in the parish world and how, and especially in the area of making disciples, and how that affects the emergence of religious vocations. Our primary, what we're best known for historically was our work in charism discernment, which is over 20 years old, and we have worked directly with 100,000 Catholics now. And when I say directly, I mean like sitting down and listening to you directly, not just being in a group. Listening to their stories of their encounters with God, how God has used them, that sort of thing, which is really what drew us into evangelization, because we realized very quickly that many people could not discern because, in fact, they didn't have much of a relationship with God. There was very little spiritual life there, even though they were active in their parishes, in their dioceses. And so consequently, the charisms weren't emerging yet in their lives, and they had a discernment struggle. So what I just want to share with you briefly, and here is my wonderful little, okay. This is something that we cover in our Making Disciples seminars, but it's a very simple schema that we use frequently to describe the sort of adult Christian developmental stages. Now, there's nothing very special about this, but we found it extremely useful. We talk about seeker, disciple, apostle, and seeker is just that first and fundamental conversion that the Catechism talks about, that first initial yes to Christ, to follow him. And then that leads into the life of discipleship, which of course is the second ongoing lifelong conversion process. And out of that emerges mission and vocation and charisms. And so that is the apostle being sent, the experience of being sent by Christ for the behalf of others. So we found this just very simple and very helpful, especially when working with parishes. Now, the book I wrote, Forming Intentional Disciples, was focused entirely just on the first journey. From how do we help people who may be coming from I don't even believe in God, because huge numbers of Catholics, let's face it, are functioning agnostics or atheists. Not just in this country, but in many other countries, and we work in other countries as well. And so they have a religious label that they may not yet have jettisoned, though they're jettisoning it really fast. People who do not practice are dropping the name in vast numbers. We have to understand that. They will not be holding on to it. And the younger they are, the more likely this is true. So the issue is, what about that very first process? So maybe I don't even know there is a God, and if there is, why should I care? I have just begun the journey of following Christ as his disciple in the midst of his church. How do you actually facilitate that journey? That was what the book was about. The stat that, I'm sort of the queen of depressing statistics. People said, I hardly made it through the first chapter of that book. I wanted to throw it away. I totally understand. But the one stat that really stunned me and sort of stayed with everyone was that less than half of American Catholics are certain you can have a personal relationship with God. Now, since the book has come out, I've had many opportunities for many conversations with leaders in the Catholic world who tell me privately, why, yes, that was my experience. I had one man come up to me at a major conference like this, invitation only, on evangelization. And at the very first break, he walked up to me and said, "Until I read your book last month, I did not know it was possible to have a personal relationship with God." I have to admit, my mouth went, I gaped like a fish out of water for several minutes, just trying, because I'm used to having that conversation outside those settings, but not in this setting. And I finally said, "Just help me understand, help me why do you think that is so?" He said, "Well, now this is a good guy, right? He's highly committed, he's faithful, he's deeply involved, he's in full-time ministry forming clergy." Yes? Okay? And he came from a really good, practicing, faithful Catholic family. He said, "But we just never talked about it. I literally didn't know it was possible." Those kind of conversations should be impossible. I should never have them again. But I'm afraid it's probably going to continue for a while. Times are changing. But if that is happening for many, even some of our very best, most committed, most faithful people, what about all those who are streaming out of the church right now, especially the young adults, who have a vocation? As I often have said before, it's like Dorothy Day did not know she was Dorothy Day. Do you know that, right? When she walked out of that abortion clinic, it never occurred to her at that moment that she was Dorothy Day as we think of Dorothy Day. Because a vocation emerges out of your lived encounter, sustained encounter with Christ. And she hadn't been there yet. She didn't know who she was, in a sense. She didn't know the identity and the destiny God had prepared for her. And many, many of our own people, that's where they are. So we really want to, St. John Paul put it this way, many Catholics still don't have that explicit personal relationship, that attachment to Christ. They have the capacity given to them to believe, but not the explicit personal relationship. And of course, the theology behind that is very interesting. Half of U.S. millennials, this is the latest U.S. religious landscape survey, this is not in the book, have already left the church, meaning they've left the identity. They have dropped the name Catholic. And 40% of those who remain are thinking about leaving. Cultural Catholicism. Basically, God has no grandchildren. Not in the 21st century. Nobody is going to ride their parents' or their grandparents' coattails. Because the culture and the practice of their generation is that everyone is supposed to revisit this issue no matter what faith they were raised in. This is not just true for us. It's true for everybody. Everybody's wrestling with the same dynamics. I've got to revisit it as a young adult and choose for myself. So now there's a lot of also very positive stuff going on that I unfortunately don't have a ton of time to go over. But millennials are fascinated by Pope Francis, as I'm sure you know. When he was here in Washington and back on the East Coast last year, one of my friends was standing for 5 hours in line at a papal mass. And he said, "I expected to be surrounded by people like us, like you and me, right? The incredibly super hardcore." He said, "No, it was pagans as far as the eye could see. And it was evangelizer's paradise." He said, "Man, all I had to do was turn to everyone around me and just say, 'So, why are you here?' Whoa, you're off and running." He said, "The woman next to me, she was agnostic or something, but her passion was for the environment, and she wanted to see the Pope who'd written about the environment. The guy on the other side with the mohawk," he said, I'm here to find out if that guy," meaning Pope Francis, "is right about that Jesus guy." He said, "I prayed with that man on the spot." He is building millions of bridges of trust and rousing intense spiritual curiosity in many, many, many non-insiders. But guess who gets to walk across the bridges he's building? Your future sisters and brothers and priests are standing in those circles right now. They don't know who they've been created, in a sense, destined to be, because they haven't yet lived the encounter out of which that will emerge in their own lives. So, that's what we're talking about. The church makes the distinction between the power to believe given to us in baptism, in valid baptism, and the personal act of faith. And of course, discipleship addresses what? That personal act. That personal response of faith, which sets in, basically going the whole spiritual growth process that leads to the discernment of vocation. Vocation is a fruit of discipleship. And parishes and dioceses that seriously evangelize have all kinds of people clamoring to know what God wants of me now. Now they want to know. Now they're in the place to begin that journey. But this is what's supposed to come first, and institutionally, practically speaking, at the parochial level, we have not been systematically having this conversation with people. So, very briefly, in the book, I talk about the journey typical 21st century people make on their way to discipleship. These are every one of them is like a threshold of conversion, a mini conversion that deepens and deepens and deepens. But there's trust, curiosity, openness, seeking, and intentional discipleship. Now, I've spent 4 chapters on this in the book. Obviously, I can't go over all that right here. But here's one of the most important things I just want to pass on. What we've heard from parish and diocesan leaders for about 10 years is that roughly they would estimate, this is their best guess, there's no studies on this, best guess, maybe 5% of their active members are actually conscious disciples. Which, in terms of vocation, means that about 95% of their folks are not yet ready to discern. It's a developmental issue. There is no such thing as vocational unemployment in the Catholic Church, right? You're baptized, it's too late. But do we have the leadership, the vision, the structures, the practices in place to facilitate the development, that encounter and the spiritual growth that gets you to the place where you can start discerning? That's the question. If you think of that white space as every human being on the planet, 7.3 billion of us, Jesus Christ, we believe, is the mystical center for everyone who lives, whether they've ever heard of him or not, know of him or not, Christian or not, baptized or not. 1/3 of the human race is actually baptized, almost exactly. And if that looks small, it's actually the largest percentage in human history, because the truth is most human beings have not had access in the last 2,000 years. So, that's just a very brief to look at the sacramental issue. I want to look at where people are, what we're finding about where people are in their lived relationship with God, which is what the thresholds are about. So as people move closer, trust is a huge issue. If there is no trust in place, which is not faith, it's just some positive personal association with Christ, with the church, with Christianity, or maybe I think all of that is crap, but I like you. And I don't even know why, because I think your religion thing is weird. So strange. But I like Sister Kristen, because she's funny, and she's kind, and she's trustworthy, and she helped me out, and I like her. She's my living bridge. The only bridge I may have, but she's my bridge of trust. Just like in many ways Pope Francis is operating like a bridge of trust, initial bridge of trust for many, many people. As people move closer, the next issue is Curiosity, this is casual spiritual curiosity. It is not commitment. It's like casual dating. You're interesting. It's on that level, okay? And then as people become more and more curious, we foster that curiosity. Then there's that moment when they just open the door just a crack to the possibility of personal change. It's a huge transition that many 21st century people do not make because it means I've given up total control over my life. Well, my imagined total control, of course, but you know what I mean. I feel like I had total control. I could always say yes or no about everything, but now I'm opening the door and I'm acknowledging to God and to myself that I'm actually open, maybe just 1% to the possibility of personal and spiritual change. That is a huge turning point. And something that people really need help, a journey to make. And then as they move further on, then we get into serious seeking, which is like, this is not casual dating, this is dating with a purpose. This is, are you the one dating, okay? Am I going to commit here? This is starting to look serious, it's going to change my life. Oh my gosh, what's going on? That's seeking. Only in this case, of course, we want them to be deciding, will I follow Christ as his disciple in the midst of his church? That's what I'm contemplating. And for people in that state, it feels like a quest, like a spiritual quest. There's a lot of internal drama. It may not look externally dramatic, but it feels dramatic inside. And then there's the point where you begin the journey of, yes, I will do that, or what I'm calling intentional discipleship, which is, no, it's not a brand. People accuse me of some kind of brilliant marketing, or I'm like, no. We started using it in desperation because I just got so tired of talking about discipleship and have everybody go to sleep around me. I mean, they did. They'd heard the word, it just went right over them. If I said intentional, they all stood up and said, oh, what do you mean by intentional? I'm like, well, how did you get here? Did you roll out of bed at home and find yourself in this room? I don't think so, right? But it is fascinating, especially in the parochial world, how we're intentional about everything else in our lives as adults, but somehow when it comes to faith, we think it just happens to you while you sleep. Like the way I hope to one day wake up and find myself a brain surgeon. So, intentional, yes, as in conscious, as in deliberate, okay? And the thing is, everyone we meet, and every one of us here in this room, and everyone in our parishes, in our dioceses, in our congregations, in our communities, are in spiritual motion, because it is a real relationship. And some of us are on vacation because we're tired. And some of us our bodies are here, but our heads are on the way out. And some of us are like moving back in, And some of us took a break. Every conceivable journey there is happening in our congregations. So it's a living thing. Not only in our culture is religious identity fluid, but our lived relationship with God has always been fluid. And I know you know this, and I know you know this in the people you work with. One of the first times I ever dared to ask a vocation director this question, it was before I wrote the book. And I said, just curious, what would you say if I asked how many of the men you work with are intentional disciples? His comment was none. I said, you want to expand on that just a little bit? Give me some clues here. He said, well, it's because nobody's ever talked to them about it. I mean, it just wasn't an issue. Now, what's interesting, the next time I asked a vocation director that question, the book was out, he had it with him. So I said, okay, I want to know what you think. He said, oh, no, we're very aware of that now. And we're working, with our guys and all. They described all the steps they were taking. But then he said something really revealing. He said, but none of our men, and this was a diocesan priest, none of our men knows how to help anyone else become a disciple. Yeah. Now, there are a couple of seminaries now who are in the early stages of incorporating that into formation. But vocation is the fruit of discipleship. So many of the people who come to work with you, and I'm sure you have a lot of people even that you're thinking about, you're contemplating right now. You've interviewed them, you've talked to them, you have some sense of where they are. A lot of our active Catholics are in the very earliest stages of spiritual development. They're back in trust. If somebody's body is in the church, if they're at the parish, they attend Mass, whatever, they're probably at least at trust. If there was no trust there, they would be gone. But they may not have moved beyond that earliest and most passive stages of spiritual development. The early stages, trust, curiosity, and openness, are essentially passive. We don't want to confuse them. And the majority of Catholics, in our experience, are still back, probably at trust or early curiosity if they're practicing. Which means what you propose to them, think about it. St. Thomas famously observed, of course, that which is received according to the mode of the receiver. Meaning, basically, whatever you're telling me, I'm filtering through my own experience, my own understanding, and I can only take in so much. I will filter out the stuff that doesn't make sense. If most of our people are spiritually in this very early stage, and that probably means, I don't know for sure, I'm not a vocation director, that a lot of the people coming to you may still be just at that early stage. That's what, as you explain to them the life, the call, the discernment process, as you take them on retreat or all the things you do, that's what they can take in. Many of our leaders at the parochial level are still at that stage. I can't tell you, since the book came out, I've had all these private conversations where leaders in the church, archbishops, seminary faculty, pastors, religious, lay leaders at all levels, have told me when I began my ministry, I was not yet a disciple. I am now. And this is what happened. Here's my journey. But I wasn't then. Not because these are bad people. They are not bad people. But we weren't talking about this. And many of them literally didn't know that it was even an issue. So, and that has all kinds. We have rearranged our pastoral care, our practice, our vocational discernment, everything unconsciously around where our people actually are. The average practicing Catholic in our experience, and we've worked now with well over 500 parishes in 140 dioceses, and actually with 140,000 people now. This is our best guess. There's no studies on this. Just based on what we know now. Pretty typically, they're sort of at trust, and the cultural norm in the average parish is at trust as well. Which means, and we have met, you have to understand, because in our discernment process with charisms, we do a lot of one-on-ones, and we sit down and listen to people's stories of being used by God, which is how we learned all this. I've met great saints. I've met people in the unitive way. I've met, people who are so far along and embedded in parishes where they feel completely alien and unsupported because they are already so far beyond the norm spiritually. And so if this cultural working norm, not your mission statement obviously, but your cultural working norm is back at trust, but you've got people who are great saints, or maybe not, maybe they're just a little bit further on, maybe they're in openness, they will still feel extraordinary. And you know what happens? they suppress the expression of their discipleship to fit in. This is so stunning. We did not know this. We're just learning it by listening to people. People tell us, I felt like I was betraying my Catholic faith by being a disciple. Seriously. One of my friends said, when the culture changes and you start to make this a normal conversation, he says, you discover you have disciples you don't know about. Because now they were in hiding in our own parishes. They were so intimidated by the de facto practicing culture of the other lay people in their congregations that they went into hiding. They suppressed, they didn't tell anybody about it, which means they're not in leadership either, right? And they're not discerning. He said, but now the culture's changed, they feel safe, and so they come out. He said, they're coming out of the shadows. Now, we are working right now, what is exciting, in the last 4 years, the conversation has changed so dramatically. We're so very excited. Hundreds of parishes are seriously engaged with the challenge of, seriously doing evangelization at the parish level. Whole dioceses are now embarked on this journey, campuses, etc. So the conversation is really changing dramatically. But because of where we are, I am, again, not sitting in your shoes. I don't know what you're hearing. But I would just guess that probably the majority of the people who approach you as vocation directors are not yet disciples. What happens, if that's the case, is it shapes everything, including pastoral practice. Basically, we have accepted relative fruitlessness as normal at every level of the past of our life. And so it's really hard for us to even envision what it would be like to be in a place that is filled with people who are passionate about their walk with God and who want to know what God wants of them. I've worked with parishes, relatively small American parishes, one of whom already had 30 guys ordained from the parish of 900 families. Already, one bishop. They had 20 more in seminary as I talked to them. They had their own homegrown community of sisters, their own homegrown community of brothers. They had amazing lay apostles doing things on a global scale. They'd started most of the social justice ministries in their area. They had phenomenal giving, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And as I listened to their stories, I kept saying, this isn't normal, right? I'm like, it's really not normal. And they kept saying, it's normal here. In my parish in Seattle, when I was a relatively new Catholic, that's where we started, I co-founded the Institute with my Dominican pastor. So I spent 16 years working very closely with Dominican comics named Michael. But one of the things they did there is they had just a homegrown parish-based, very informal, anybody who was interested in religious life or priesthood, come be part of the group, come talk about it. We had men and women together. They read the documents and they talked about the charisms. They went through the discernment process. And if you went out and had a visit, you visited the chancery or you went on a retreat with a community, you had someone to come home and talk to about it. It was safe, it was confidential, so that this was a place to talk about things before your family got wind of it, and started pressuring you and all that stuff. In 2 years, we had 8 different people enter religious life or priesthood. Out of us, we had a community of 650 families, one of the smallest in the diocese. That was more than the whole archdiocese put together. It's not rocket science. There's an awful lot that could happen in the parish level that could sort of lay the foundation for your discernment processes. You do not and should not be carrying the whole burden yourselves. Having to be everywhere, meet everyone, get them used to the idea, oh yes, there's a vocation, there's something to discern, If we're making disciples at the parochial level, that just becomes a normal part of the conversation. All right, let's see. This issue of fruitfulness is really also true of the liturgy. This is the one thing, when I do work with clergy, I do quite a bit of that now, the room gets very intent. Because of where most of our people are, the impact of the graces they're objectively receiving is muted. Because there's no faith, no repentance, no intention of embracing a new life. I mean, the subjective disposition of the recipient is the indispensable precondition, which is, of course, what evangelization addresses. I love this one image. It's a Benedictine. But I love it because I live in Colorado, and it's just such a mountain thing. St. Thomas, that faith is truly a contact with Christ. Without the contact of Christ, we are dead to him. The stream of his life passes us by and enters us as a rock in the midst of the river remains unaffected by the flow of waters. Till faith is established, the great redemption has not become our redemption. The riches of Christ are not ours in any true sense. I mean, that's the image I have of a mountain stream, the boulders in the center of it, and the water is just flooding over it like springtime snow melt, pouring over you on all sides, but never penetrating. Because that personal openness is not yet present. And of course, then it's a lifelong thing. The church has been talking about this for hundreds and hundreds of years. But obviously, I could start off really well, on fire, excited, and 10 years down the road, I've lost my way somehow. And somebody else who walked through their confirmation wakes up 15 years down the pike and goes, oh, whoa. And now they're on fire, and now they're moving. So it is a lifelong, this issue of disposition, of spiritual openness, of seeking, is a lifelong issue. And how to sustain that? I mean, for most of us, for most lay people, the parish is the only place that's going to happen. It's the only access we have. It's the only house of formation most of us will ever have access to. Unless, of course, we get to know you. But one of the issues is we have all these baptized people. Evangelization addresses the disposition issue, and the church actually talks about revival. Now, I was raised as a Southern Baptist in Southern Mississippi, and we did real revivals. Okay. So all your Louisiana jokes are funny. But Catholics do revivals too. The graces that were objectively received wake up and now flood through people's lives when we address them. They've been baptized, they've received it, but now the power of the Holy Spirit is released in their lives. Father Michael Sweeney, my co-founder, used to say he thought that evangelicals were poaching on Catholic sacramental grace and didn't know it. Because of course, a lot of evangelical churches are like half Catholic, and people in background. And what were they doing? Well, because objectively, in a sense, the sacraments are real. They give you a spiritual itch you can't scratch. You can't quite, there's something there that you can't quite get rid of. Even though you're running in the opposite direction, you call yourself an ex-Catholic and all that stuff, recovering, and there's that itch. And so someone comes along and, preaches the call to discipleship, and you respond, they have now said yes, and the graces are released in their lives. And fruit is what comes out of this process, including discernment of vocation. The sacred liturgy is supposed to be preceded by evangelization, fruit, and conversion. It can then produce its fruits in people, which includes involvement in mission and service of the church's unity. most of our discussions of the liturgy, at least in and I'm not a liturgist and I don't pretend to be, but the ones I've observed, we always talked about what does it mean to be active, what does it mean to be conscious, participants. Nobody talked about fruit. But of course, the whole economy says evangelization, fruit, and conversion is supposed to come before it, and then we see fruit. The problem is, what if we have very few people discerning mission? That's a coal in the canary. I mean, that's a canary in the coal mine, I'm sorry. Canary in the coal mine. It's a major sign. We have a fruit problem. And that means we got to go back and look at our faith, conversion, and evangelization issues. Because there's supposed to be fruit. And what if we're at each other's throats? My entire Catholic life, I am a convert. I walked into a church in a civil war, had no idea what people were shooting about. Because, of course, no one could have been more clueless than I was about the insider issues. And I can't tell you how tired I am of the reaction to the reaction to the reaction to the 60s. But that serving the church's unity, being able to go beyond the real history, and I know there's a lot of traumatic history that occurred then. And yet, one of the issues, when discipleship is the norm, people are given the spiritual power, the strength, the courage to move beyond that. Because we're truly engaged in mission together and we're centered in Christ together. And the divisions are not our identity. It's the fruit. And if we're in constant conflict, then we have a faith, conversion, evangelization problem. Basically, our failure to evangelize artificially suppresses the emergence of vocations. I mean, because they're there. We believe every baptized person has something to discern. I mean, that is what the church formally teaches. It is part of pastoral governance to call forth the charisms and vocations of all the baptized. But we have almost no vision, no structures, no leadership in place, no, if you will, structures to make this happen. What that means for the average Catholic, now here I'm just talking like from the parish pew level. The working assumption for most of us is that vocations are rare, not universal. You all, obviously, you do understand you're all in the honorary saint track, right, as far as we're concerned. Because God clearly zapped you, right? You know, something happened because I'm normal and you are not. I'm sorry, but this is true. This is how it works, pretty much at the lay level. We are normal, and you are extraordinary and rare. And the other issue that comes up a lot, if a culture of discipleship produces a culture of vocation. In the absence of a culture of vocation, people confuse the emerging signs of discipleship with a call to religious life, which a lot of you are nodding, so you've obviously seen this. And I could tell you many, many, many stories. One woman, a friend of mine, she entered religious life, she said, because I wanted to talk about God, nobody else was doing it, but the sisters were. So I could go talk. In other words, she didn't have to hide around them. Another a young man we know, had extraordinary conversion experience after 15 years of methamphetamine addiction. Just very dramatic story. So here he is, totally on fire and single. Yes, every priest in the diocese was like, whoa. They were swarming the poor guy. I mean, the vocation director was there, but everybody was there. And the only problem was, because we had no category, he was clearly not normal. So, ergo, he must have a special vocation. Because he was way too excited about this whole faith thing. Now, the issue was, he's a working man who was basically a laborer who had barely squeaked through high school and never read a book in his life until his conversion. He was not going to make it through 6 years of graduate philosophy and theology. Nobody could take that in. But they had no other category because he was not normal. And it as one Dominican told me once, he said it was a real choice. As he entered the Dominicans, but he said, you made being a lay apostle sound so interesting. But in other words, there has to be discernment. Discernment has to be laid on a foundation of discipleship. And honestly, it would save you. I know I'm talking about things you all know. Obviously, you're probably spending a lot of your time dealing with people who are not ready yet, right? Just spiritually, personally, they're not there yet. And it's not your fault, and it's not, in a sense, their fault. They're doing their very best to, somebody said, well, you should check this out, and they're checking it out. They're good people. But if our parishes were your partners in facilitating and evangelizing and facilitating a culture of discernment where this was normal for adults to say, what does God want of me? It'd be Katie bar the door. Every parish we know that does serious evangelization, one of the first questions that comes up is, what does God want of me now? In our work in charism discernment, I can't tell you how many people have come to us. One woman said to me, she said, this is the first thing the church has ever offered me that helped me, gave me some handhold to figure out what God wants of me. She said, I went to my pastor and said, I think there's something I'm supposed to be discerning. He said, no, honey, you're a single mom. And she's going, it hasn't exactly escaped my notice that I'm a single mom. But there's something more. And then she told me privately she was actually considering Benedictine. She thought maybe there was something there. But he had no category for this. The church is fulfilling her mission when she guides every member to discerning and discovering their own vocation and living it. So, just really quickly, if a lot of the people who come to you, one of the first things I would probably do is say, where are they in their lived relationship with God? And when we teach this, we teach a very simple, we call them threshold conversations, but basically it's just, I know you all get spiritual autobiographies. I might suggest that rather than just doing it in writing, you do it orally. You probably do that anyway. But just ask them to tell you the story, where they've been and where they are now. If you can hear kind of where their journey has been, and especially where they are developmentally now, and the thresholds are a very helpful way to do that, it helps you know where to meet them right now, help them continue the process, and what sort of, if you will, a preliminary spiritual development is necessary before they can actually begin discernment. Typically, the whole area of pre-evangelization, we have no structures That's people in those early stages of trust and curiosity, the journey from distrust to trust, trust to early curiosity. Pre-evangelization is a huge issue. I was just, for those of you who know, have you read the book Kerygma in Crisis? This is a 1965 classic, Jesuit. Really fantastic stuff, but he was a missionary in Japan, and the way he lays this out is so amazing. But how critical those early stages are, and the truth is, there's a good chance the majority of the people who contact you are in those early stages right now. So how do we help them continue and give them a chance to wrestle with the initial proclamation of Christ? The basic, the fundamental, the kerygma, that is the heart and soul of our faith, that awakens initial faith. They need to have a chance to really grapple with that. And so that whole process, you may have to facilitate that intentionally. By the way, our experience is only a few people come out of a single experience of evangelization as disciples. This is partly because people are starting so far back. And this is something we did not know. But as they grapple with this for the first time, issues arise in their lives that they themselves were unaware of. Things like, wow, I didn't even know you could have a personal relationship with God, and oh my goodness, now that I know, it's scary. This is not necessarily a good thing, you know what I mean? So I'm going to stop where I am and wrestle with that. Or I confused activity with relationship with God, big one. I thought that if I did X, Y, and Z, that was relationship with God. Or, there's a whole variety of things. Sometimes lay people literally don't even have a category for stepping out of the crowd and making a personal response to God. Because they have no experience of prayer, and the Mass is their only experience. And in the liturgy, everything happens en masse, and it's totally scripted. But you can't say yes to God with a script, you know what I mean? So they literally don't even have imaginative categories for this. So typically what we find after the first evangelizing experience is they've moved, many of them, the majority have, but maybe into curiosity or into openness, but not all the way. We don't want to drop them. It's a journey. We're trying to teach parishes to do this, not to drop people, but you too, because you're going to be walking with a lot of people like this. All right, let's move along. Okay. The disciple phase, that's when fruit starts to manifest. This is when people go public, feel strong enough to go public with their faith. They begin to witness in the marketplace. They begin to pray. The charisms begin to manifest at this point. And with the charisms comes a call. The charisms can be very important clues as to what your overall vocation is. They're not the same thing as your vocation. They serve it, but they're still... Our experience is if people start discerning charisms, they start discerning vocation. We have seen that over and over and over again. But it's this especially, what happens when they discern charism is they, all of a sudden, their understanding of themselves as now personally responsible for some part of the church's mission and life. I'm no longer just a receiver. Now I am an apostle. I'm someone whom Christ is sending. And that transition is enormous for the typical lay Catholic. And that is what pushes them out to begin discerning where God wants them to be. Disciples just bear lots of fruit, including vocations. They pray, they pass on their faith to their children, they give, they serve, etc. But they clamor to know what's next. And so the apostle stage or missionary disciple, Pope Francis, exactly the same thing. This is the stage, the developmental stage at which the vast, almost all vocations emerge. Now, this is just Sherry talking. There's no studies on this. This is just based on our experience to this point. It is my very rough estimate that only about 2% of all the charisms and 2% of all the vocations that we have been given are being manifested. and exercised. Not because there's such a thing as vocational unemployment, but because it's a developmental issue, and most of our people are so far back, this is not yet a developmental issue. It doesn't take forever. In the right facilitating, intentionally supportive, community, people can make the journey from seeker to disciple to apostle in 1 to 2 years. It is not a glacial process. Now, the first seminary I know of in this country is deliberately doing two things. One, making sure all their guys are disciples, and that's integrated into the whole 6 years. But then they're also teaching them how to help someone else make this journey. But most of the time, that's not part of our formation. So the number of our people who reach this stage of spiritual development is our vocational issue. And it's not just true of us as individuals, it's true of parish communities. The average parish culture, I think, as I mentioned, in our experience, the norm is right about trust, or maybe early curiosity. There are a lot of people embedded in that community who are beyond that. But because they're embedded in an overall culture that unintentionally suppresses or sort of fights against their spiritual growth, they either go into hiding, they backtrack to fit in, or a lot of them leave. There is a hidden, the number 2 reason why people leave the Catholic Church, and especially those who go to the Protestant world, is because my spiritual needs weren't being met. One of my friends had 6 different people in 1 month come to her saying, I'm ready to leave the parish for X church down the road, the usual evangelical church. And she just said, why? She said, just listen to them. She was able to talk 4 out of the 6 out of leaving right on the spot. And why were they leaving? Because something was happening spiritually. They were growing. But they felt they couldn't find anyone in the parish to talk to. So they went to where they were going to go where you could talk about it. They talked to her. She said, oh, I know what that is. Here, let me, connected them with people. It was great. The 2 who left, after the parish culture changed, they came back. So the fact that our cultural norm is on average there, average evangelical congregation, it's early discipleship. Believe me, they are not spiritual geniuses. Those are my people, and they're not saints, okay? They just know this one conversation has to happen, and that's part of their culture. And then the parish I described is up here. Now, it's fascinating. We're seeing, as I said, many parishes on this journey, many parishes who are seeing the fruits, great fruitfulness begin to emerge in their lives as they make this journey. Okay. Done. I think I'm done. I think I've run to the end. Thank you so much.